The Aurora drifted in the emptiness of space, its once proud body now a broken shell. Debris floated around it like forgotten dreams, twisted metal and torn panels reflecting the dim light of distant stars. It had been weeks since the battle, and the ship was a ghost, its crew scattered, its purpose lost. But for Commander Elias Rook, there was only one reason he had come back: a promise. He stood in the cockpit of a smaller shuttle, his hands gripping the controls as the wreckage of the Aurora loomed larger in the viewfinder. His heart pounded in his chest as memories flooded his mind. The Aurora had been his home, the people aboard like family, but now it was just a memory. The mission was over. The war was over. And yet something inside Elias wouldn't let him move on. "I have to find her," he whispered to himself, his voice barely a breath in the cold emptiness. He had searched for days, but something about the wreckage pulled him back. He couldn't explain it. There was a gut feeling that wouldn't let him rest. Something was out there, somewhere within the twisted remains of the ship. Someone. As the shuttle's engines hummed, Elias pushed the craft closer to the wreck. His suit's display flickered, showing signs of damage from the earlier battle, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. He had seen worse. He had been through worse. His eyes darted across the debris as he carefully maneuvered the shuttle through the dark corridors of the wreck. Silence surrounded him, thick and suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of his equipment and the distant crackling of dying circuits. Suddenly his scanner beeped, faint, irregular. Elias paused, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He wasn't sure if it was just a glitch, but then it came again. A faint pulse, something, was alive. Without thinking, he powered down the shuttle and made his way into the wreck. His footsteps were careful, deliberate, as he entered the wreckage of the ship's lower decks. The corridors were dark, a twisted maze of broken walls and scattered debris. The stench of burning metal and forgotten memories filled the air, mixing with the metallic taste of fear. "Hello," Elias called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No reply, only the sound of his own breath heavy inside his helmet. He moved deeper into the wreck, the pulse of his scanner growing stronger. It was real. Someone was out there, trapped, alive. His mind raced. How could this be possible? The Aurora had been torn apart. It should have been impossible for anyone to survive. His hand gripped his blaster tightly, just in case. But all he could think about was the voice he hoped he would never hear again. The voice of the one person he thought had been lost forever. Lysera. She was an alien, blue-skinned, with eyes that gleamed like stars in the night sky. She had been his ally, his partner in battle, and maybe, just maybe, something more. When the Aurora went down, Elias had thought she was gone. No one had ever found her body. Her escape pod was never recovered. She had vanished into the void, and Elias had carried the weight of that loss for months. But now there was hope. The wreck seemed endless, its dark corridors and broken walls closing in around him. His breath quickened. The sense of urgency grew stronger. He had to find her. She had to be alive. And then, just as he thought he might lose his mind to the silence of space, he heard it. A faint sound, just barely audible above the hum of his suit. It was a breath, slow and steady, like a heartbeat in the dark. Elias stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. The sound came from just beyond a collapsed bulkhead. His pulse quickened, his hands shaking as he moved toward the sound. With a grunt, he pushed through the debris, his heart hammering in his chest. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, but then, there behind the wreckage, he saw it. A faint blue glow, a glimmer of life. "Lysera," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence. And there she was. The blue-skinned woman lay against the wreckage, her skin pale but glowing faintly, like the stars themselves. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and when they locked with Elias, a soft smile spread across her face. It wasn't the smile of someone who had been saved. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting. "You found me again," she whispered, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. Elias' breath caught in his throat. He had found her. After all this time, after all the pain, he had found her. It was the moment he had been waiting for. The wreckage around him no longer felt cold or suffocating. The fear and uncertainty melted away. Because in that moment, he realized that no matter how broken the world around him seemed, no matter how dark the void of space, there was still hope. And she had always been there, waiting. Elias stood frozen, staring down at Lysera, her blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the wreckage. His heart beat wildly in his chest, as if trying to catch up with the flood of emotions surging through him. After all these months, after everything he had been through, here she was, alive. Lysera blinked, her eyes struggling to focus. But when she finally looked at him, there was a spark of recognition. That same warmth that had always been there, the light of someone who refused to let go of hope, even when all seemed lost. "You found me again," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. There was no bitterness in her words, no anger for the long time they had been apart, only relief, only a quiet acknowledgement that the impossible had happened. Elias knelt beside her, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he reached out to help her sit up. His voice caught in his throat. I thought you were gone. I thought I'd lost you." She shook her head gently, her long, dark hair falling in messy strands around her face. "I almost was," she replied, her smile sad but sincere. "But you promised me you'd find me, and you did." Elias swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking into him. A promise. He had made it long ago, during a time when the war had felt endless, when everything had seemed like it would fall apart. He had promised that no matter what happened, he would come back for her, but he had never truly believed it. He had thought, like everyone else, that the war would take them all. But here she was. "What happened?" Elias asked, helping her to her feet. She winced, her body clearly weakened from the long weeks of isolation. He could feel the tremor in her hands, the thinness of her frame. But her eyes were still sharp, still full of the fire that had always defined her. "I was trapped in a maintenance pod when the Aurora went down," Lysara explained, her voice soft but steady. "I thought I had sealed it up tight enough to survive, but the ship was torn apart in the blast and the pod got stuck here, buried in the wreckage. I tried to send out a distress signal, but everything went dark. And then, well, I just waited." "Waited?" Elias echoed. He couldn't hide the pain in his voice. It hurt him to think of her, alone, stuck in a broken pod for all this time. She had been waiting in the dark, with no one to hear her, no one to come for her. "I didn't have a choice," she said with a shrug, as if it was no big deal. But Elias knew better. She was hiding the toll it had taken on her. "I had to keep hope that you would come, that I would see you again." "I never should have left you," Elias muttered, feeling the weight of his own regret. He should have stayed. He should have fought harder to bring her back, but the war had been all-consuming. It had made him forget about everything except survival. Now, standing here in the wreckage, all those mistakes seemed so foolish. Lysara's fingers gently touched his arm, bringing his focus back to her. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "The war took so much from all of us, but it didn't take everything. We're still here. That's what matters." Elias let out a long breath, his heart pounding. He had been so lost in his guilt and his regrets that he hadn't even thought about the fact that she was alive. They were both alive, and that was something no one could take away. Suddenly, the silence between them was broken by the faint sound of footsteps, the soft clatter of metal. Elias tensed, his hand instinctively going to his blaster, but Lysara stopped him, her eyes alert. "Pirates," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. "They've been tracking the Aurora ever since it went down, if they find us." "We'll deal with them," Elias cut in. He could already feel the adrenaline surging through him, the old instincts kicking in. The fight was far from over. But even as he spoke, a dark realization settled in his chest. They were not alone here, and these pirates wouldn't care who they were. They would kill without hesitation, take everything they could, and leave them for dead. Lysara gave him a grim look. "We need to move quickly." Elias nodded. Together, they started moving through the wreckage, avoiding the open spaces where the pirates could spot them. The air around them was heavy with tension, the sense of danger closing in. Yet, amidst the chaos of the broken ship, Elias couldn't help but feel something else, something more powerful than fear. Hope. Lysara had been waiting, but she was no longer the only one holding on to hope. Elias had found her, and now they would find a way out, together. The wreck of the Aurora loomed large around them, a shattered memory of what had been. But it wasn't the end, not for them. "We'll get through this," Elias said, his voice more determined than he had felt in a long time. "I promise." Lysara looked up at him, a small but hopeful smile on her lips. "I know you will." And with that, they moved forward. The wreckage behind them seemed just a little less dark, a little less hopeless. The wreck of the Aurora felt like a living, breathing thing. The twisted metal groaned and creaked as if mourning the lives lost when it was torn apart. Elias and Lysara moved through the broken corridors like shadows, their footsteps the only sound in the stillness. The ship was a maze, a death trap waiting to close in around them. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. "Where are we going?" Lysara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her strength was still fading, but she refused to slow Elias down. He could see the effort in her eyes. She was pushing herself, trying to ignore the weakness in her limbs. Elias glanced over at her, his gaze softening. "I have a shuttle parked just ahead. It'll take us out of here." "Good," Lysara said, nodding. She didn't ask questions. She knew better than to waste breath on doubts. There would be time to think later. For now, survival was everything. The two of them moved through the wreck with purpose, but as they turned a corner, the ship seemed to swallow them whole. The hallway ahead was blocked, metal beams strewn across the path, a reminder of the violent destruction the Aurora had faced. Elias cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He turned to Lysara, ready to take her hand and lead her through another path when he saw the look in her eyes. She was staring at something he hadn't noticed before. A patch of scorched metal, a symbol, the old emblem of the Aurora's crew, the same one he had worn on his uniform when they first met. That patch had meant something. It had represented their unity, their mission, the hope they all shared for the future. It was a memory that had always kept him going, even when everything felt hopeless. Lysara knelt down, her fingers tracing the edges of the emblem, her expression distant. She wasn't just looking at the metal, she was looking at something beyond it, something deep within her heart. "Do you remember when we first met?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Elias' heart skipped a beat. He had tried not to think about it. He had tried to push those memories into the corners of his mind, but now, with Lysara so close, they were impossible to ignore. He remembered it all too clearly, the battle, the chaos, the moment they had been thrown together, fighting side by side against impossible odds. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I remember. I was new to the Aurora, didn't know anything about being a leader, but you—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "You made me believe in something bigger than myself. You taught me how to fight, how to survive, but most of all, you taught me how to trust again." Lysara's eyes softened, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "You were always a good man, Elias. You just didn't know it yet. That's why I stayed by your side, because I saw the strength in you even when you couldn't see it yourself." Her words cut through him like a blade. The truth of them echoed in his mind. Back then, he had been broken, lost in the endless war, haunted by his own doubts. But Lysara had been the light in his darkness. She had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. But now, as they stood together in the wreckage of the Aurora, that light seemed to flicker. She was weaker than he remembered, her strength fading with each passing minute. He couldn't lose her again, not after everything they had been through. "I should have come for you sooner," Elias said, guilt pulling at him like a heavy weight. "I should have searched harder. I shouldn't have left you behind." Lysara reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light against his suit. "You didn't leave me behind, Elias," she said softly. "You had your own battles to fight. We both did, but we never gave up, and that's what matters. We made it through. Together." Her words were like a balm on his tortured soul. He had blamed himself for so long for not being able to save her, for not doing more. But in that moment, he realized something. They had made it. They had survived. And it wasn't just because of his strength or hers. It was because they had never given up on each other. "You're right," Elias said quietly. He gave her a small, weary smile. "I guess we're pretty good at this surviving thing, huh?" Lysara's smile widened, though it was tinged with sadness. "Better than most." The weight of their shared history hung between them, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a bond that had survived the worst of the war, the worst of the galaxy, and now, the wreckage of the Aurora. It was a bond that couldn't be broken, no matter how many scars they carried. The sound of footsteps came again, distant but growing louder. Elias' eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his blaster. The pirates were getting closer. They couldn't afford to waste time. He reached out for Lysara's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm now. "There's no time to waste." Lysara nodded, her gaze steady. "Lead the way, Commander." And together, once more, they moved forward, their hearts carrying the weight of the past, but also the hope for the future. The wreckage of the Aurora might have torn them apart, but it would not break them. Not now, not ever. The wreckage of the Aurora seemed to stretch endlessly before them, a twisted maze of collapsed corridors and shattered walls. Elias led the way, but his mind kept drifting back to Lysara. She walked beside him, her steps steady but slower than before. The battle, the isolation, the weeks alone in the wreck, he could see the toll it had taken on her. Yet despite everything, she never faltered, not once. Her strength, even in her weakened state, still held an undeniable power. Elias couldn't help but glance at her as they moved through the ship's dark, broken halls. Her once vibrant blue skin was pale, and her breath came in shallow, labored gasps. She wasn't just physically tired, he could see it in her eyes. The years of war, the separation, the survival, it all weighed on her. It weighed on him too. He had lost so much in this war, so many people, so many dreams, but it was the loss of Lysara that had haunted him the most. It wasn't just that she had been taken from him, it was the guilt of thinking he had failed her. They had promised to survive together, but the war had torn them apart. Elias, Lysara spoke, her voice quiet but strong. Her eyes were focused straight ahead, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands. Do you ever wonder why we're still here? The question caught him off guard, and he stopped walking. He turned to her, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? She gave him a soft smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I mean, after everything, all the pain, all the loss, why do we keep going? Why do we keep fighting? Elias took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He had never truly allowed himself to think about it. The war had been all-consuming. It had taken everything from him, and for so long the only reason he had kept going was to survive. To make sure that what they had started didn't end in defeat. But now, with Lysara by his side again, the question was harder to ignore. I don't know, Elias admitted, his voice low. Sometimes it feels like the only thing left is to keep moving, to keep surviving. But I think it's more than that now. Maybe it's about holding on to the people we care about. Maybe it's about finding something worth fighting for. Lysara looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something deeper. And what's worth fighting for now? For a moment, Elias didn't have an answer. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind raced, his heart filled with conflicting thoughts. The war had taken so much from them both, and it was easy to fall into the trap of thinking there was nothing left. But then, looking at Lysara, alive, breathing, still fighting, he realized something. I think it's you, he said finally, his voice firm and sure. It's always been you. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Elias could see the way Lysara's expression softened, her eyes brightening. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, a silent gesture of understanding. I think it's you too, she whispered. You're the reason I kept going. I never stopped believing that I would see you again. The truth in her words settled into his chest, warm and steady. For all the pain they had been through, for all the heartache and loss, they still had each other. In the darkest moments, when the whole universe seemed bent on crushing them, they had always found a way back to one another. Elias felt a rush of gratitude, not just for the fact that they had found each other again, but for the strength they had drawn from one another all those years. In the midst of the war, in the face of impossible odds, they had kept hope alive. And now, as the pirates continued to close in on them, hope was all they had left. But hope, Elias realized, was powerful. It was something no one could steal from them, not the war, not the wreckage, and certainly not these pirates. He turned, motioning for Lysara to follow. We need to keep moving. The shuttle isn't far now. She nodded, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. What if we don't make it? What if? Elias cut her off gently. We will make it together. And with that, they moved forward, the wreckage behind them now seeming less like a trap and more like a path they had to walk. The ship might have been broken, but they were. Not yet. As they moved through the wreck, Elias realized something else. The Aurora may have been the ship that had brought them together, but it was their shared strength, their bond, that would carry them through the darkest moments. And no matter how far they had come or how much they had lost, that was something no one could take away from them. The pirates were still out there hunting them, but they had a secret weapon, something stronger than any weapon, stronger than any enemy, each other. And that was enough. The quiet hum of the wreckage had grown louder, the air thick with tension as Elias and Lysara continued their journey through the shattered Aurora. Every step they took echoed through the ruins, a reminder that time was running out. The pirates were getting closer. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a cold sense of urgency gnawing at him. They were still alive, still moving forward, but Elias knew that if they didn't get to the shuttle soon, it would all be for nothing. The pirates wouldn't show mercy. They never did. Lysara walked beside him, her breath still shallow, her steps a little slower. She had been strong, stronger than anyone could have expected after being trapped in that pod for weeks. But Elias could see the toll it was taking on her. Every now and then, her hand would twitch, a small sign of the pain she was trying to hide. He didn't speak of it. There was no need to. They both knew the reality, but every time he glanced at her, his heart ached. She had always been the one to hold things together, to show him strength when he felt like falling apart. Now it was his turn. He had to protect her. He had to get them both out of here. "You're doing all right," he said softly, breaking the silence. Lysara's lips curved into a faint smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "I've been through worse," she replied, her voice steady despite the weariness in her eyes. "We both have." It was true, they had seen horrors that most people could never even imagine. But this felt different. This wasn't just about surviving, it wasn't just about the war anymore. They had both been through so much, fought side by side, and yet now, as they stumbled through the wreckage of the Aurora, it wasn't the war that haunted Elias. It was the idea of losing her again, of losing everything they had fought for. A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. A distant thud, the unmistakable sound of boots on metal. Elias tensed, his instincts kicking in. He raised a hand to signal for Lysara to stop. They both stood motionless, holding their breath, listening. The noise came again, louder this time, footsteps fast and heavy. He could hear the faint chatter of voices, too. "Pirates!" He gripped his blaster tighter, eyes scanning the surroundings. The corridors ahead were dark, the wreckage creating perfect hiding spots. But it also created a maze that the pirates could use to trap them. "Move," Elias whispered urgently, his voice low. He pulled Lysara to the side, behind a pile of fallen metal, and they crouched together, trying to make as little noise as possible. His heart was pounding, his thoughts racing. There was no way they could take on the pirates in this state, not with Lysara barely able to stand, not with the wreckage closing in on them from all sides. "Do you think they know we're here?" Lysara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sure they do," Elias replied, his eyes narrowing as he peered through the gaps in the debris. "They've been hunting us since the ship went down. They know we're alive." Lysara's expression darkened. "Then we need to move faster." Elias didn't need to hear more. He nodded. They couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to reach the shuttle, and they had to do it before the pirates cornered them. There was no other choice. "Follow me and stay close," Elias said, voice steady though inside. Panic was beginning to rise. He led the way, weaving through the wreckage, trying to stay out of sight. Every now and then he would pause, listening for any sound of pursuit. But the pirates were quiet now, too quiet. It was almost as if they were waiting, letting them think they were safe. That was the worst part, the waiting, the uncertainty. It was a game to the pirates, a hunt, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they found them. Elias and Lysara moved swiftly, but they couldn't keep up the pace for much longer. Lysara's breath was coming harder now, her body fighting against the strain. Elias kept glancing at her, his heart heavy. She was doing her best, but the weight of everything, the battle, the isolation, the constant fear, was wearing her down. She had always been the strongest of them, but even the strongest had their limits. He had to keep her safe. He had to keep her alive. The shuttle wasn't far now. He could feel it. They were close. But just as they rounded another corner, Elias heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy boots pounding toward them, getting closer by the second. The pirates were right behind them. He turned to Lysara, his face set with determination. "Get to the shuttle," he ordered, voice sharp. "I'll hold them off." "No," Lysara gasped, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving you." "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice firm. "Get to the shuttle now." Lysara hesitated for a moment, her gaze meeting his. There was fear in her eyes, but there was also trust in him. And that was all he needed. With one final look, she turned and ran toward the shuttle, her legs shaky but determined. Elias stayed behind, his blaster raised, ready for whatever the pirates threw at him. He could hear them now, their laughter and taunts echoing in the dark. But he wouldn't let them win, not this time. He wouldn't lose her again. Elias sprinted toward the shuttle, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was laser-focused. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He could already hear the pirates closing in behind him, their footsteps a harsh reminder that they were out of time. The Aurora's wreckage, once a symbol of hope and unity, now felt like a cold, claustrophobic tomb. Lysara had made it to the shuttle. He could see the faint glow of the cockpit lights through the broken hull. She was inside, and that thought kept him pushing forward despite the overwhelming odds. But as Elias neared the entrance, the sound of footsteps came faster, closer. The pirates had seen her too. "Damn it," Elias muttered under his breath, slamming his hand onto the shuttle's door control. The hatch didn't open. His fingers fumbled as he tried to get the old systems to respond. The pirates were closing in, and the seconds felt like hours. He forced himself to calm down, taking a deep breath. Focus. There was no time for panic, only action. He slammed his hand against the hatch again, this time with more force. The shuttle's engines hummed to life, its old systems slowly coming back online. "Elias, hurry!" Lysara's voice came through the intercom, crackling with static. The sound of urgency was unmistakable in her voice. She was already preparing for takeoff. "I'm coming, Lysara," he shouted back, his voice tight with determination. He could see them now, the pirates, a group of 6 or 7, appearing from the shadows. Their weapons were drawn, their faces cold, but Elias wasn't afraid, not anymore. The door finally opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Elias dove inside, rolling into the cockpit. Lysara was already strapped in, her eyes wide with worry, but there was a flicker of relief in them as she saw him. "Close it now," Elias barked, and Lysara obeyed without a word. The shuttle's door slid shut with a heavy clunk, sealing them inside. They were safe for now, but not for long. Elias turned to the controls, his fingers dancing over the familiar levers and switches. The ship's old engines roared to life, and with a sudden jolt, they were airborne. He glanced out of the small window, seeing the pirates' figures just as they reached the landing platform, their guns raised. The Aurora was a wreck, but it was still a danger to them, a reminder of everything the pirates wanted to claim. "Hold on," Elias muttered, the shuttle shaking as it lifted off. He pushed the engines to full throttle, sending them soaring upward, away from the wreckage. The pirates wouldn't give up easily, but for now, the shuttle's speed was their best defense. The wreck of the Aurora grew smaller and smaller beneath them, a fading memory of all they had lost. It wasn't just a ship that had fallen apart. It was their lives, their friends, their purpose. Everything had been scattered to the winds. But as they flew higher, a sense of calm began to settle over Elias. They were still alive. They were still together, and that was enough. Lysara turned to him, her face tired but resolute. "We did it," she said quietly, the words heavy with meaning. "We made it." Elias didn't reply immediately. He couldn't. The relief he felt was overwhelming. He had been prepared to lose her, prepared to fail. But somehow they had made it through. And it wasn't just luck. It was because they had never stopped fighting, never stopped believing in each other. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did." Lysara smiled, a soft, sad smile that spoke of the years they had shared and the battles they had fought. "I knew we would," she whispered. For a moment there was only silence between them. The hum of the shuttle's engines filled the space around them, and the stars stretched out in front of them, endless and cold. But for the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Elias glanced over at Lysara again, the weight of their journey pulling at him. She had been through so much. He had been through so much, but they were here, together, alive, and that was more than either of them could have hoped for. "We've lost a lot," he said, his voice soft but filled with truth. "But we haven't lost each other." "No," Lysara replied, her eyes meeting his, filled with something deep. "We haven't." As the shuttle sped through the stars, Elias felt a surge of hope. The wreck of the Aurora was behind them, but their story wasn't over. It had just begun. There was still a long road ahead, still dangers to face and challenges to overcome. But as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't face, nothing they couldn't survive. And for the first time in a long while, Elias allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ashes of what they had lost. Together. The stars outside the shuttle window stretched in long, quiet streaks like the endless possibilities of the future. The Aurora, the ship that had once been their home, was now nothing more than a fading memory. Elias looked out at the black expanse of space, his mind still processing everything that had happened. They had made it. He had kept his promise. He had found her again. But even now, as the shuttle soared through the stars, the weight of the journey pressed heavily on his chest. The years of war, the loss, the pain, they all lingered heavy shadows at the edges of his thoughts. He glanced at Lysara, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the controls, her eyes distant yet focused. "I thought I had lost you forever," Elias whispered, his voice breaking the silence. Lysara turned to him, her gaze steady but soft. "And I thought I would never see you again, but here we are, Elias, still alive, still breathing together." She reached out and placed a hand gently on his, her touch warm and reassuring. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Despite everything they had been through, despite all the darkness and uncertainty, they were still here. They had survived. "I never stopped thinking about you," Elias said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The memories of the days they had shared, the battles they had fought side by side, came rushing back. He had thought about her every day in the quiet moments when the war had seemed endless, when all he wanted was to hear her voice, to see her smile again. "I know," Lysara replied softly. "I never stopped thinking about you either. I carried the memory of you with me every day. It was the only thing that kept me going, Elias." The shuttle hummed around them, a constant reminder that they were moving forward, away from the wreckage of the past. But the road ahead was still unknown. They couldn't go back. They couldn't undo the things they had lost. "You saved me, you know," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back then, when I thought I had nothing left to fight for, you were the one who gave me hope. You were the reason I kept going." Lysara's eyes softened, and she squeezed his hand. "I didn't save you, Elias. You saved yourself. You just needed someone to remind you who you were." Her words sank deep into his heart. It wasn't the first time she had said something like this, but it always felt new, like she was revealing a part of herself he had never fully understood. She had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. "I'm not sure I would have made it without you," Elias said, his voice thick. He turned to look at her, his gaze soft but intense. "I don't think I ever told you that, but it's true." Lysara smiled, a small, wistful smile that spoke of all they had shared, of the battles, the losses, the sacrifices. "You don't need to tell me, Elias, I've always known." A silence fell between them, not awkward or uncomfortable, but peaceful. They didn't need words to fill the space. They had already said everything that mattered. They had fought for each other, survived for each other, and now they were here, together in the vastness of space, with nothing but the future ahead of them. The shuttle's instruments beeped softly, signaling a new course ahead. Elias glanced at the display, then back at Lysara. "Where do we go now?" Lysara's eyes lit up, a spark of excitement flashing in them for the first time in what felt like forever. "Wherever we want," she said, her voice full of possibility. "We've earned the right to choose, Elias. There's nothing holding us back now." For a moment, Elias simply stared at her, taking in her words, feeling the weight of them. She was right. They had fought for their lives for each other. They had survived against all odds, and now they could choose their future. A feeling of peace settled over him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The war, the destruction, the pain, it was all in the past. What mattered now was what they did next, what they chose to do. "We can go anywhere," Elias said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "We can do anything." Lysara nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, we can." Elias smiled, the first real smile he'd worn in years. It felt like the beginning of something new, something bright and full of hope. The Aurora might have fallen, but they hadn't. They were still here, still fighting, still alive. And as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't face. The stars outside the window stretched on, endless and beautiful. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt as though the universe was full of possibilities. Together, they would write their own story. A story not of loss, but of survival, a story of hope. They had found each other again, and this time they weren't letting go.